Almost 2 years ago, I did a video where I covered 10 minor but noteworthy facts about The Lord of the Rings that many casual viewers or readers might not have known about. I haven't rewatched it, but it was probably bad. So consider this an unofficial follow-up video where I'll be talking about 9 minor facts about popular Lord of the Rings characters. Yes, just 9, not 10, because I don't have 10. Number 1, Theoden and Aragorn are distantly related. So someone pointed this out in one of my comment sections several months ago, and I thought, this is the cool kind of trivia that needs to make its way into a video. Yes, Aragorn and Theoden share a common ancestor, a man named Vidugavia. Vidugavia was a Northman prince who lived during the 13th century of the Third Age and became the king of Rhovanion after allying himself with Gondor. Both Theoden and Aragorn are descended from this man, although not through the same lineage. In Aragorn's case, he is descended from Vidumavi, the daughter of Vidugavia, who controversially married Prince Valakar of Gondor. Descended from Valakar was King Onderher, whose daughter, Firiel, wed King Arvedui, famous for being the last king of Arthedain. From Arvedui, the chieftains of the Dunedain ruled in an unbroken line until they eventually reached Aragorn. In Theoden's case, he is descended from one of Vidugavia's other children. We know this because about 600 years after Vidugavia's death, one of his descendants, Mahari, helps Gondor fight against the Wainriders. It's Mahari's son, Marwini, who removes some of the Northmen to the Vales of Anduin, where they would become the first of the Aethiod. Descended from Marwini was Eorl the Young, who would become the first king of Rohan, and Theoden is obviously a descendant of him. So yeah, their blood relation is so distant that it's basically irrelevant, but it's a cool Easter egg nonetheless. Number 2, Theoden was born in Gondor. Speaking of Theoden, despite being the king of Rohan, he was not born in Rohan. In fact, he was born somewhere in Gondor and actually spent the first 5 years of his life there. There's a bit of a funny story behind this one. So Theoden's father is Thangel, spelt with a TH, and his grandfather is Thangel, spelt with an F. Due to the fact I often have trouble pronouncing the TH sound, I'll just call them Junior and Senior so no one gets confused. Basically, Senior was not a well-loved king. He was greedy, and his abrasive nature meant that he was often at odds with his marshals and his children. In fact, he seems to have been so bad that Junior, his only son and heir, left Rohan to serve in Gondor upon reaching adulthood, and didn't really have any intention of returning. He lived in Gondor for almost 20 years before he married a woman named Morwen Steelsheen, who was a Dunedain of Dol Amroth, and 5 years later, in 2948, she gave birth to Theoden. Unfortunately for Junior, his time in Gondor came to an end in 2953, when Senior finally killed over and died, and he reluctantly returned to Rohan to take up the crown. He ended up being a good king, despite the fact he now spoke Sindarin as a first language, and that he had spent almost the entirety of his adult life in Gondor instead of Rohan. And another related mini-fact, given that Morwen was a Gondorian of Dunedain origin, Theoden was actually half Gondorian himself. Number 3. Aragorn and Boromir have met in the past. When Boromir arrived in Rivendell, it was as a complete stranger. At the Council of Elrond, he was the only attendee who wasn't really acquainted with any of the other attendees before his arrival, perhaps with the exception of Gandalf. When Aragorn speaks for the first time at the Council of Elrond, Boromir has no idea who he is, and Elrond has to introduce him. As far as Boromir knows, he's never met Aragorn. But this may not be true. Under the alias of Thorongil, Aragorn served both King Thangel of Rohan and Steward Ecthelion II of Gondor, Boromir's grandfather. Considering the high esteem that Ecthelion held Thorongil in, it's almost certain that he was fairly close to the steward's household. This is aided by the fact that we know that Denethor knew Thorongil well enough to be suspicious of his actual identity. Aragorn only left Gondor in 2980, 2 years after Boromir was born, so it's also quite likely that Aragorn actually met a young Boromir during his stay in Gondor, and given the fact that Boromir was only 2, it's no surprise that he wouldn't remember what Thorongil looks like. Number 4, Sam is the odd one out. Yes, Sam is quite a bit different to his companions. In what way, you might ask? Well, Sam is the only member of the Fellowship to be of low-born birth. Aragorn is the chieftain of the Dunedain, Boromir is the son of the steward of Gondor, Legolas is the prince of Mirkwood, Gimli is a member of the House of Durin who is closely related to King Dain, Gandalf is one of the Maiar, Frodo is the Master of Bag End, Pippin's father is the Thane of the Shire, and Merry's father is the Master of Buckland. What's Sam? He's a gardener from a working class family. Even amongst his fellow Hobbit companions, Sam is still a bit of an odd one out, in the way of not sharing any family relation with any of them. Merry and Pippin, despite being a Brandybuck and a Took, are actually first cousins, and Frodo is also a cousin to both Merry and Pippin through sharing a common great-great-grandfather in Gerontius Took, the Old Took. Sam is cousins with no one. Number 5, Pippin is still a child. Speaking of hobbits, they technically reach adulthood at the age of 33. Before that point, well, they're technically children. And during the Lord of the Rings, Pippin is actually only 28, so he's still several years off being considered an adult. Funnily enough, despite being considered a child, he's still older than characters like Éomer and Éowyn. It makes for an interesting perspective. Imagine being Pippin's parents and realizing that your child, your only son, has run off from the Shire with his eccentric, middle-aged cousin and his cousin's gardener. At least they could rest a little easier knowing that his relatively sensible first cousin was accompanying him. Number 6, Gandalf is short. In the Peter Jackson films, Gandalf comes across as quite tall. Ian McKellen is about 180 centimeters in height, and he wears a giant hat, which makes him tower over the other members of the cast. But while Gandalf no doubt had an imposing presence that could make him seem far taller than what he was actually quite short. In some of Tolkien's scribblings that relate to The Hobbit, Gandalf's height is given as 5'6", which means he would have been somewhat short for a man of Middle-earth. Tolkien also points out that not only was he short, he also had a stooped posture, so he would appear even shorter most of the time. When compared to other members of the Fellowship, Gandalf would have been something of a middle ground. He was significantly taller than Gimli and the Hobbits, but he was also significantly shorter than Legolas, Aragorn and Boromir, who were all over 6 foot tall. It kinda makes sense why Gandalf loved spending time in the Shire or running around with dwarves. They were the only times he felt tall. Number 7, Gollum probably eats babies. Yes, everyone knows how wretched Gollum is, and what he eats definitely reflects that. He was planning on eating Bilbo when they had their fateful meeting beneath Goblin Town. We know he eats orcs, he eats animals raw, and food like elven lembas and properly cooked stews disgust him. But if you thought he couldn't sink any lower, think again. In the Shadow of the Past chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells Frodo that the Woodmen of Mirkwood spoke of a new terror that was going abroad. It apparently climbed into nests or dug into holes to eat young animals, and, rather disturbingly, crept through windows to steal babies in their cradles. These rumours undoubtedly refer to Gollum. But these are just rumours, right? And we know how easy it is for rumours to exaggerate. The problem, however, is that we know Gollum has absolutely no issue eating children. In fact, when Bilbo first meets him in The Hobbit, it's explicitly said that Gollum had just finished eating a small goblin imp. So there's a good chance that Gollum did in fact steal and eat the babies of the Woodmen. So probably don't feel bad for him when he fell into the fire. Number 8, Gimli tried to go on the quest for Erebor, but was rejected. In the Unfinished Tales, we learn that after Sauron's defeat, Gandalf is recounting the entire story of the lead up to the quest for Erebor to Frodo, Merry and Gimli, who states that he was away when Gandalf first visited the dwarves. At the end of Gandalf's tale, Gimli reveals that he wanted to join the quest for Erebor, but was rejected on account of being too young. At the time, Gimli was 62, well into adulthood, and believed himself fit for anything. To be fair to Gimli, he had a right to be annoyed about this. At 62, he was only 15 years younger than Kili, and only 20 years younger than Fili, the next two youngest members of Thorin's company. And claiming 62 was too young was quite hypocritical from Thorin, who fought in the Battle of Azernal Bazaar aged 53, not to mention his cousin Dane, who was only 32 at that battle. The more truthful reason is, probably, Glóin wanted to protect his son, and the company might have come to the conclusion that they were already risking too many members of the House of Durin, thus Gimli had to remain behind. Number 9, there weren't many beards. Beards are all the rage at the moment, in the Lord of the Rings fandom and in real life, but contrary to popular depictions, many of the characters in the Lord of the Rings were actually beardless, not exactly by choice either. Many characters simply couldn't grow beards. For example, Aragorn is often depicted with a beard, but in fact, due to his elvish blood that came down from Elros, he could not grow a beard. This is the same for characters like Boromir, Faramir, Denethor, and Prince Imrahil. In fact, it was quite likely that many of the Dunedain of Gondor and Arnor simply could not grow beards. And that is our 9 character facts. I hope you enjoyed them, or at least found them interesting, and I hope it didn't ruin Lord of the Rings for you. Yes, Sam is a peasant, so what? So are you. Yes, Aragorn doesn't have a beard, so what? No big deal. Yes, Gollum eats children, don't ask why not. Cheers, farewell, and